Listen, hear that? Beyond the hum of this recording, beyond the quiet of this room, listen for the wind. Not the gentle breeze of today, the old wind, the channel wind, the wind that carried the scent of salt, of kelp rotting on shingle beaches and later. The sharper, colder tang of high explosives. It's a wind that remembers. It remembers Pierre. Pierre Moreau, a fisherman, a quiet man. A man the world, in its thunderous rush toward war, would have called insignificant. They laughed at his net. His precious net, called it useless, a relic, a waste of good rope, until the day it held the throat of a leviathan. Until the day it stopped a battleship dead in the water. A German battleship, Scharnhorst, pride of the Kriegsmarine, brought low by a fisherman's net. Let me tell you how. Let me tell you about the quiet men who shaped the storm. Pierre Moreau wasn't born to headlines. He was born to tides. Born in 1901, in a village clinging to the Normandy coast like a barnacle to rock, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, a place where the horizon was measured in fathoms, not miles. His hands learned the sea before they learned letters. Small, strong hands, knotted like old roots, permanently stained with tar and brine. His father taught him. His grandfather before that. Generations of Moreaus, reading the water's moods, the shift of currents, the secret language of gulls. Pierre knew the channel's soul. Its moods, its deceptions, its hidden teeth. His net, the net, not some factory trawl, not nylon slick and modern. This was his net, woven over winters by lamplight in the cramped cottage smelling of damp wool and boiled potatoes. Hemp rope, thick as a man's thumb, painstakingly knotted into a mesh that felt alive in the hands. It wasn't just a tool, it was a map of patience, of understanding where the base gathered in the cold deeps, where the soul buried in the sandy shallows. It was heavy, awkward, required strength in the shoulders and a rhythm in the hips that only years could teach. Townsfolk saw the clumsy bulk of it drying on the rack, stiff with salt, and shook their heads. Too old, Pierre? Old Monsieur Leclerc would rasp, tapping his own new shiny gill net. Progress, mon ami. This is 1939, not 1839. That thing belongs in a museum. Pierre would just smile, a slow, quiet thing that barely touched his eyes. He'd run a calloused thumb over a knot, testing its hold. The sea doesn't care for progress, Henri, he'd murmur. Only truth, only time, it ran out. September 1st, 1939. The news crackled over the wireless in the village Estaminet. Distant thunder made real, Poland, then silence. An unnatural quiet over Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. The fishing boats still went out, but the laughter on the quay faded, replaced by low voices, furtive glances at the sky. The channel, Pierre's eternal companion, suddenly felt like a moat, a barrier about to be breached. He mended his net with extra care that autumn, each knot pulled tight, a small defiance against the coming storm. He felt it in his bones, the fisherman's instinct. The water was restless, cold currents shifting, a deep premonitory thrum beneath the waves. May 10th, 1940, the sky filled with the wrong kind of birds. Stukas, their shriek wasn't the cry of a gull. It was the sound of the world tearing. Belgium, Holland, then France. The German tide rolled forward relentless, like a rogue wave no one saw coming. Sainte-Marie-du-Mont didn't fall with a bang. It fell with a chilling efficiency. Boots on the cobbles before dawn. Grey uniforms materializing from the mist rolling off the sea. Calm, orderly, terrible. The commandantur set up in the old town hall. Curfew bells replaced church bells. The familiar faces on the street now wore masks of fear or blank resignation. Pierre watched from his cottage window, his net half-mended on the table. His boat, La Marée Basse, bobbed uselessly at the pier, watched by a bored sentry. Useless, the word echoed. His life's work, his connection to the rhythm of things. Useless. They took the big trawlers first, requisitioned for the Kriegsmarine. Coastal patrol, minesweeping, anything but fishing. Pierre's smaller Marée Basse was deemed too insignificant. A bitter irony. He was allowed to fish, under strict supervision, 2 hours before dawn, 2 hours after dusk. A tiny, grudging concession. His catch, what little he pulled from the wary sea, went straight to the German quartermaster. Only scraps came back, rations, grey bread, watery turnip soup. The net, his beautiful heavy net, gathered dust in the corner. What use was it now? To feed the enemy? Pierre's hands grew idle. His eyes, usually scanning the horizon for weather signs, now scanned the streets for patrols. For trouble. There was another presence in the silenced village. Not German, French but marked. Élodie Dubois, a nurse, young, from Cherbourg. She'd fled south as the panzers rolled, only to find the trap closing here, on this narrow strip of coast. She took a small room above the shuttered bakery, paid for with dwindling francs and silent tears. She tried to help. A cut finger for old Madame Gagnon. Fever for the blacksmith's boy. Small acts of resistance against the crushing weight of occupation. The Germans tolerated her. For now, a useful native face. But her eyes held a constant vigilance, a flinch at sudden noises. The way she'd press herself against the wall when a staff car drove past, knuckles white on her medical bag. She saw Pierre often, the quiet fisherman always with his hands busy, mending something, whittling driftwood. He never spoke much, just a nod, a slight tip of his worn cap, a silent acknowledgement of shared sorrow. Once near the well, he'd silently handed her a small, perfect crab he'd found clinging to his anchor rope. Fresh, sweet meat. A luxury, a tiny rebellion against the grey rations. She took it, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second, cold, rough. Her eyes, deep pools of exhaustion, flickered with something. Not just gratitude, a spark, a reminder of a world before boots on the street. She smiled, not knowing why. Just because warmth, however small, was unexpected. He turned away quickly, pretending to adjust a rope on his dinghy. But he saw it, that spark. It lodged in his chest, a small, stubborn ember. The net stayed in the corner, dust gathering on its thick cords. Pierre's son, Jacques, 18 years old, restless fire in his veins, couldn't stand the quiet defeat. He talked in hushed tones in the back room of the estaminet, now a shadow of its former self. Whispered names, plans, the resistance. Pierre listened, his face unreadable. He saw the fire in Jacques' eyes, the same fire that had once lit his own when he'd hauled in a record base. But Pierre saw deeper. He saw the cost written on Élodie's face. He saw the German patrols, efficient, relentless. He saw the notice pinned to the town hall door, the execution of 3 men from a neighboring village for harboring a downed RAF pilot. Jacques' fire could burn everything down. Pierre put a hand, heavy and firm, on his son's shoulder one evening. "Patience, mon fils," he murmured, his voice low, barely audible over the crackling fire. "The sea doesn't rage against the rock. It wears it down. Slowly, the tide always returns." Jacques had shaken off the hand, frustration flashing. "While we wait, Pierre, they take everything. Our boats, our food, our dignity." Pierre looked at his net, hanging limp in the gloom. "Some weapons," he said softly, "are not fired. They are cast. They are waited for." Jacques didn't understand. Few did. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It was a rumor, a whisper passed like contraband salt. A British commando raid. Not here, further north. But they'd used something unusual. Something that fouled a German patrol boat's propellers. A net. Some said it was chains. Others said it was just luck. Pierre's fisherman's mind seized on it. A net. His mind, long accustomed to reading the sea's hidden patterns, began to see a different pattern. A pattern of vulnerability. Battleships were titans, yes. Armored behemoths. But beneath the waterline, propellers, great churning screws that drove them forward. Delicate machinery despite their size. Protected but not invincible. What if? What if something could be wrapped around them? Tangled in the blades? Not to sink the beast, perhaps, but to cripple it, to bring it to a halt, to make it vulnerable. His old, heavy, useless net, its thick hemp cords, its resilience, its ability to embrace, to hold fast. Not fish, but machinery. The idea took root. Not as a plan, not yet. Just a seed. A terrible, fragile seed in the dark soil of occupation. He began to watch the harbor differently. Not for fish. For ships. German ships. Patrol boats mostly. But occasionally, larger vessels would anchor further out, silhouettes against the setting sun. He noted how they maneuvered. how their screws churned the water into a froth. He studied the tides, the currents that flowed strongest just outside the harbor mouth, currents that could carry something towards a moving target. He started mending the net again, not for fishing. He reinforced certain sections, strengthened the lead line, the weighted bottom edge, with extra rope, making it sink faster, hold its shape. He wove in lengths of discarded anchor chain he'd salvaged, not for weight alone, but for their brutal, unyielding texture. To catch, to bite, to hold. He worked at night by the guttering light of a smuggled candle. His fingers, stiff with cold and age, moved with a new, urgent purpose. Elodie saw him once, late, through her window, bent over the bulky mass on his table, his face etched in concentration. She didn't know what he was doing, but the intensity in his posture. It was different, not the quiet resignation of the fisherman under occupation. This was the focus of the hunter. She felt a strange flutter in her chest. Hope? Or just the desperate need to believe in something? Jacques brought news, dangerous news. Whispers of a major naval operation brewing for the Germans. Something big was coming. Reinforcements. A breakout? The Allies were watching the channel ports like hawks. Every ship that moved mattered. Pierre listened silently, his eyes on his net. The seed had sprouted. It was no longer just an idea. It was a terrible necessity. He knew the risks. If caught preparing this weapon of sabotage, not just death, torture for him, for Jacques, for anyone remotely connected. Elodie. He thought of her smile over the crab. The spark. He couldn't involve them, not directly. This was his burden, his net, his sea. He approached Captain Renard. Not a military captain, a fisherman. Captain of the Petit Jean, one of the few remaining small trawlers still allowed limited fishing. A man whose face was a roadmap of wind and worry, whose eyes held the same deep fatigue as Elodie's, but hardened by years of hauling nets in winter gales. Pierre found him mending lines on his deck, under the watchful eye of a young German rating, who clearly found the whole business tedious. "Renard," Pierre said, his voice low. He didn't waste words. He gestured subtly towards his own cottage, then out to sea. "I have something that might slow the wolves." Renard's gaze flickered from Pierre's face to the bored sentry, then back. He grunted, spitting over the side. "Slow them. Pierre, they have guns that can sink a mountain. What have you got? A rusty anchor?" "Not an anchor." Pierre's voice was barely a breath. "A net, my old net. The big one. I've modified it." Renard snorted, but his eyes narrowed. He knew Pierre, knew he wasn't a fool. Knew the old fisherman understood the sea in ways Renard, for all his years, sometimes envied. "A net against a battleship? Mon Dieu, Pierre, have you gone soft in the head? They'll laugh you into the next village."
"They already laugh," Pierre said quietly.
"But the sea doesn't laugh, Captain. The sea only waits and holds." He described it simply, not the mechanics. He wasn't an engineer. The principle. The thick cords, the chains woven in. How it might be deployed from a small boat, under cover of darkness and tide, across the path of a departing vessel. How the propellers might bite into it, wrap it tight like a fish, tangled beyond escape. "It won't sink her," Pierre admitted. "But it might stop her, cripple her screws, leave her wallowing like a beached whale. Long enough." He didn't finish. Long enough for what? For the RAF to find her? For other ships to react? He didn't know. He only knew stopping her mattered. Renard was silent for a long time. He looked at his own hands, scarred and salt-cracked. He looked at the grey water slapping against the Petit Jean's hull. He thought of his sons, one in a POW camp near Berlin, the other missing after Dunkirk. He thought of the ration cards, the fear in his wife's eyes. He thought of the German battleship he'd seen looming on the horizon just last week, a floating fortress that made his sturdy trawler look like a child's toy. He looked back at Pierre, at the absolute terrifying conviction in the old man's eyes. Not fanaticism, certainty, the certainty of the tide. Renard spat again, a long, thoughtful stream into the harbor water. "They will laugh, Pierre," he said finally, his voice rough. "Right up until the moment they don't. When? And where will you get the boat? La Marée Basse draws too much water in the shallows near the channel mouth. They'd spot her a mile off. Pierre had thought of that. He'd watched the patrols. He knew the routines. He knew the blind spots in the harbour watch, the stretches of shingle beach hidden by dunes where a small dinghy could be launched unseen, especially on a moonless night with an outgoing tide. "Not the Mary Bass," he said. "Your dory. The one on your deck, small dark paint, barely a whisper on the water. I can handle her, you just need to be seen fishing in your usual spot. Up the coast, as alibi for you, for everyone." Renard closed his eyes. The weight of it pressed down. To agree was to sign his own death warrant if caught. To refuse, to live with the knowledge he could have tried. He opened his eyes, saw Pierre waiting, not pleading, just waiting, like the net waited in the water. "The tide turns at 2:17 a.m. tomorrow night," Renard said flatly. "New moon. Fog's been rolling in thick after midnight lately. Good cover." He didn't say yes. He stated a fact. Pierre nodded. That was yes enough. "And Pierre?" Renard's voice dropped even lower. "If you're caught, you know what they'll do. They'll make you talk. About me, about others. Can you hold your tongue? Can that net hold your silence?" Pierre looked out at the grey water, at the hulking shape of a German minesweeper anchored beyond the breakwater. He thought of Jacques' fire. He thought of Elodie's spark. He thought of the taste of salt on his lips that morning, unchanged for 60 years. "The sea holds many secrets, Captain," he said softly. "Some things sink deeper than others." He touched his chest. "This stays with me." Renard simply nodded. The pact was sealed, not with words of glory, but with the quiet understanding of drowning. They were already sinking. This was just ballast. The day crawled. Pierre moved through his routine like a ghost. He collected his meager rations. He nodded to neighbors whose eyes darted away. He avoided Jacques, unable to bear the questions, the fire that might ignite too soon. He saw Elodie briefly near the well. She was carrying a bucket, her arms straining. He moved to help, but she shook her head minutely, a warning in her eyes. Her German corporal was watching from the street corner, lighting a cigarette with deliberate slowness. Pierre stepped back. Their eyes met. Hers held a question, a deep, unspoken fear. He gave the tiniest shake of his head. Not today, not this. He saw the confusion, the worry deepen. He wished he could tell her, wished he could promise her something. But promises were dangerous currency now. He spent the afternoon ostensibly mending buoys, but his mind was on knots. Not fishing knots, holding knots. Knots that wouldn't slip under the violent strain of tons of steel churning water. He tested the reinforced lead line. The woven chains clinked softly, a deadly music only he could hear. Night fell, thick cold. The promised fog began to curl in from the sea, swallowing the streetlights, muffling sound. It was like the village was holding its breath. Pierre waited in his cottage. The net lay ready by the door, bundled tightly, oiled to reduce noise and shine. He checked his watch by the dim light of a covered lantern. 1 a.m. Time. He slipped out the back way, through the overgrown garden that led towards the dunes. The fog was his ally, swallowing his footsteps, blurring his shape. He moved like the tide itself, silent, inevitable. Renard was waiting at the agreed spot on the shingle beach, half hidden by marram grass. The small dory, painted a dull, non-reflective grey, was already in the water, tethered to a stake. No words were spoken, just a brief hard clasp of forearms, a look that said everything. Renard's face was grim, etched with the fog and fear. Pierre nodded. Renard melted back into the dunes, heading towards his trawler, his alibi beginning. Pierre pushed the dory into the surf. The cold water soaked his trousers to the knee. He scrambled in, the small craft rocking. He shipped the oars, no engine, only the quiet dip and pull. The fog closed around him like a shroud. He could hear his own breathing, the lap of water against the hull, the distant mournful foghorn from the German harbor patrol boat, a sound that usually meant safety for fishermen, now a marker of the enemy's presence. He rowed with steady practice strokes, hugging the shoreline, using the dunes for cover. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear of death, but with the terrible responsibility of the net at his feet. This was madness, glorious, necessary madness. He reached the position, a mile out, where the main channel deepened, where the currents converged, flowing strongly out to sea with the ebbing tide. He checked his compass by the dim glow of a hooded light. He'd timed it. The intelligence, Jacques' whispers, suggested a major vessel was due to depart Cherbourg harbor before dawn. Heading west, into the Atlantic, Scharnhorst, the name sent a chill deeper than the channel water. A monster! Pierre uncoiled the net slowly, reverently. The oiled hemp felt alive in his hands. He attached the heavy lead line to a small weighted buoy, not to mark it, but to ensure it sank fast, lying flat on the seabed across the channel path. The float line, attached to the top of the net, he secured to the dory. This was the lifeline, the trigger. He would drift with the tide, the net streaming behind him like a dark shadow on the seabed. When he judged the ship was approaching, he would cut the float line, releasing the net to rise, to hang suspended in the water column. A ghost net, waiting. He killed the lantern, sat in the dark, icy fog, listening, waiting. The only sounds were the water, the foghorn's periodic lament, and the thudding of his own heart. Minutes stretched into an hour. Doubt gnawed. Had he misunderstood the tide? Was the ship delayed? Had Renard been stopped? Had Jacques' information been wrong? Had he dragged himself and his useless net out here for nothing? The cold seeped into his bones. He thought of his cottage, the warmth of the fire, the simple weight of the net in the corner. He thought of Elodie's face when he refused to help with the bucket. The spark dimmed. The shame of cowardice pricked him. He was an old man. What could he do against an empire? Against steel giants? They were right to laugh. He was a fool. Then a new sound. Faint at first. A deep rhythmic throb, growing louder. Cutting through the fog. Not the putter of a patrol boat. This was deeper, heavier, the heartbeat of a titan. Pierre's breath caught. He strained his ears. Yes, the distinct, powerful thrum of massive diesel engines warming up. Coming from the direction of Cherbourg harbor mouth. Scharnhorst. She was coming. Right on time. Right into his current. Right into his net. Adrenaline burned away the cold. He checked the lines. The net lay waiting on the seabed, a dark promise. The dory drifted silently with the outgoing tide, the float line taut behind it. He could just make out the shape in the fog now. Not the whole ship, just a looming darkness that blotted out the fog itself. A mountain rising from the sea. Then lights, harsh military lights cutting cones through the gloom. Searchlights sweeping the water ahead, probing the fog. Pierre ducked low in the dory, pulling his dark oilskin hat low. He was a shadow on a shadowed sea. The thrumming deepened to a roar. The water began to churn violently ahead, caught in the suction of the great screws. The searchlights swept closer. When beams sliced through the fog, passing a dozen yards to starboard, Pierre held his breath. The beam lingered on the churning water, then swept on. He was beneath their notice, a piece of flotsam. The monstrous bow of the Scharnhorst loomed out of the fog, a cliff face of steel painted ghost grey. He could see the rivets, the scum on the waterline, the black muzzles of secondary guns like watching eyes. The sheer, overwhelming power of it was paralyzing. It wasn't a ship. It was a moving fortress. His net, it seemed absurd, a child's toy against Goliath. But the fisherman in him saw what the soldier might miss. He saw the water boiling astern, the precise point where the twin propellers, each bigger than his cottage, were churning the sea into a white fury. That was the target, the vulnerable heart beneath the armored shell. He judged the distance, the speed, the current. He was directly ahead of the churning water. The net lay between the dory and the approaching maelstrom. Time. It was time. With numb fingers, stiff with cold and tension, Pierre drew his knife, a simple fisherman's blade. He placed it against the taut float line, securing the net to the dory. One clean cut. He hesitated for only a heartbeat, not for fear, for the weight of what he was unleashing. For Jacques, for Elodie, for the village silenced under boots, for the sea that had given him life, now a weapon. He thought of Renard, nervously fishing up the coast, praying this madness worked. He thought of the German sailors on that bridge. Boys, perhaps, following orders, but orders that brought bombs to cities, boots to villages. He thought of his net, his patient waiting net. He pulled the blade across the rope. Snap, the line went slack. The small buoy tethered to the net's lead line bobbed briefly, then began to sink rapidly, pulled down by the heavy chain-reinforced edge. Below, unseen in the black water, the great net began to rise. Slowly at first, then faster, buoyed by the corks woven into its top line. It rose like a dark curtain, a wall of hemp and chain, unfurling silently in the path of the churning water. Pierre shipped his oars. He had seconds. He rowed hard, perpendicular to the ship's path, putting distance between himself and the trap. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He heard it. First a change in the engine note, a deep guttural thump, thump, thump that vibrated through the water, shaking the dory beneath him. Not the smooth, powerful thrum. A stammer, a cough. Then a new sound, metallic, horrific. A tearing, grinding shriek that ripped through the fog, louder than the engines, louder than the sea. It was the sound of tons of high-grade steel meeting thick, unyielding hempen chain. The sound of propeller blades biting deep, rapping, tangling, locking. The grinding roar intensified. The Scharnhorst shuddered. Visible even through the fog, her massive bulk seemed to hesitate, to stagger. Her forward motion slowed abruptly, like a charging bull tripping on a root. The searchlights, wildly swinging now, caught the churning water astern. Not the smooth boil of propellers, a chaotic, frothing maelstrom. And rising through it, like the tentacles of some nightmare sea beast, were thick, dark strands. Hemp, glinting metal chain, uncoiling, snapping taut, wrapping around the base of the rudder, vanishing into the churning foam where the screws were supposed to be. The grinding shriek reached a fever pitch, then cut off abruptly as the engines died, overwhelmed. In the sudden, shocking silence, broken only by the lap of waves and the hiss of steam venting somewhere deep within the crippled giant, Pierre heard something else. Shouts, panicked, German shouts, carrying clearly across the suddenly still water. Confusion, alarm. He rowed hard, not towards shore, not yet. He rowed parallel to the coast, staying within the fog's embrace, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the scene of chaos. He didn't look back. He didn't need to see the great ship listing slightly, wallowing helplessly in the channel current like a wounded whale. He heard the diesel generators kick in, powering emergency lights that stabbed erratically through the fog. He heard the clang of metal, the sharp bark of orders over loudspeakers, the frantic splash of boats being lowered. He heard the distant answering thrum of German patrol vessels converging on the scene, their searchlights cutting frantic patterns in the fog. He rowed until his arms burned and his breath came in ragged gasps. Only when the sounds of the stricken battleship faded behind him, muffled by distance and fog, did he turn the dory's bow towards the dark smudge of the shore, towards home, towards the village that had laughed at his net. The cold was forgotten, the fear was gone, replaced by a profound, trembling exhaustion, and beneath it, a deep, quiet river of certainty. It had worked. The impossible had happened. The sea had held. He had cast his net, and the Leviathan was caught. Dawn was a pale smear in the east when Pierre beached the dory on the secluded stretch of shingle. He dragged it high up the shore, hiding it under gorse bushes. He was shaking, not from cold now, from the aftershock. He buried the knife deep in the sand. He walked back towards the village through the thinning fog, a ghost among ghosts. The first streaks of grey light revealed the chaos before he even reached the outskirts. German vehicles, staff cars, trucks, soldiers everywhere, faces tight with urgency and disbelief. Radios crackled with static and sharp commands. Pierre kept his head down, walking with the slow, shuffling gait of an old fisherman returning from a fruitless dawn trip. He passed a group of soldiers gathered around a radio truck listening intently. He caught snatches of German. Scharnhorst, catastrophic failure. Propellers fouled. Unknown debris, possibly sabotage. One young lieutenant shook his head, laughing harshly, nervously. Unmöglich. A battleship, disabled by fishing nets. It's absurd. The British must have laid mines. The others murmured agreement, clinging to the plausible. Pierre kept walking. He didn't smile. He just felt the weight of the truth settle in his bones. They could deny it. The sea knew. He reached his cottage, locked the door, sat at his table, the same table where he'd woven the chains into the net. He poured a small glass of cheap, harsh brandy, saved for emergencies. He drank it straight, the burn a welcome counterpoint to the numbness. He was safe, for now, but the village was in an uproar. House-to-house searches began before noon. Soldiers, frustrated, angry, tore through homes looking for evidence. Weapons, radio sets, anything. Pierre's cottage was ransacked. Rough hands overturned his meager belongings. They found the brandy, drank it. They found his fishing knives, took them. They found the empty space on the wall where the net had hung. One soldier, a corporal with a thin face and eyes too old for his years, paused. He picked up a stray piece of oiled hemp cord Pierre had missed, tangled under the bench. He frowned, rubbing it between his fingers. He looked at Pierre, who sat silently in his chair, staring at the wall. "Your net, old man?" "The big one." "Where is it?" Pierre met his gaze. His face was calm, blank, the face of a man who had seen 60 years of storms. "Gone," he said simply. "The sea took it, days ago, a bad squall, tore it from the lines. Lost it all." He shrugged, a gesture of weary resignation. "Just rope, useless rope." He spat the last words with a fisherman's contempt for bad luck. The corporal stared at him, at the humble cottage, at the old man's worn clothes, his empty hands. He looked at the piece of cord in his own hand. He dropped it on the floor. "Dumb Kopf," he muttered, not unkindly, wasting good rope on the old ways. He kicked the cord aside and moved on to ransack the bedroom. Pierre didn't flinch. He just watched the discarded piece of hemp on his floor. A tiny fragment of the giant, a secret. The story of the Scharnhorst's crippling spread like wildfire, even under occupation. Officially, it was mechanical failure, mines, anything but the truth. But whispers traveled faster than German sensors. Whispers of a ghost net, of a fisherman's revenge. In the estaminet, under the watchful eyes of the few remaining German soldiers, men would catch Pierre's eye. A slow, deliberate blink. A barely perceptible nod. Respect, silent and deep. Renard clapped him on the shoulder one day on the quay, his voice gruff. "Heard the big ones limping back to Brest on one leg, Pierre. Like a crab missing a claw. Must have been a hell of a storm out there that night." His eyes held a question and an answer. Pierre just nodded back. "The channel is full of surprises, Captain." They both knew. Jacques cornered him later, eyes blazing. "It was you, Pierre, wasn't it?" The net. Pierre didn't deny it. He just placed a hand on his son's arm, his grip firm. "Quiet, mon fils. Some victories are won in silence. Some nets are cast where no one sees. Remember that." Jacques looked at him, the fire tempered by awe. He saw not just his father, but the weight of the sea in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "Oui, Père," he understood. The lesson of the tide. Elodie sought him out, not at his cottage. On the path to the well, early, when few were about. The fear was still in her eyes, but it was mixed with something else. A dawning understanding, a fierce, protective light. "Pierre," she said, her voice low, urgent. "They talk, the soldiers. They're looking, not just for saboteurs, for the thing that did it. They found rope, thick rope, like yours." Her hand fluttered nervously at her throat. "They ask questions about you, about your old net." Pierre felt a chill, not for himself, for her, for Jacques, for Renard. He looked at her face, pale in the early light. He saw the exhaustion, the constant strain of captivity, and beneath it that stubborn ember. He couldn't lie to her. Not after the crab, not after the bucket. He nodded once. A simple confirmation. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes widened, not just with fear now, but with wonder. "Mon Dieu, Pierre, you stopped a battleship?" Her whisper was reverent. She looked at his hands, the knotted, weathered hands that had cast the net. She reached out slowly, hesitantly, and covered his hand with her own. Her touch was cold, trembling, but warm, human. They laughed, she breathed. They called it useless. She smiled then, a real smile. Small, fragile, but bright as a shard of sun on the water. They don't laugh now, do they? She squeezed his hand once, fiercely, then pulled away as the sound of boots echoed on the cobbles. She melted into the shadow of a doorway, disappearing like smoke. But the warmth of her touch remained on his skin. A small comfort, a fragile hope. In that touch, he felt the weight lift just a fraction. He wasn't just the old fisherman. He was Pierre, who had cast his net. The net was gone, sacrificed, but its shadow lingered. The Germans increased patrols. Searches intensified. Suspicion hung thick as the fog. Pierre kept his head down, fished his allotted hours, mended other nets, smaller ones. He became a ghost again, but a ghost they watched. He saw the young lieutenant who had dismissed the net theory, staring at him sometimes from across the street, a thoughtful, troubled look replacing the arrogance. Pierre would meet his gaze calmly, neutrally. The sea holds many secrets. Some things sink deeper than others. Then the knock came. Not at dawn, in the grey afternoon. 2 feldgendarmes, military police, stern faces, impeccable uniforms. No pretense this time. Pierre Moreau? You will come with us. Questions. Pierre didn't resist. He placed his cap carefully on the hook by the door. He took one last look at his cottage, the cold hearth, the empty space on the wall. He walked out between them, not looking back, down the street, past shuttered windows. He saw a curtain twitch in Elodie's window. A flash of pale face, then gone. He saw Renard standing on the deck of the Petit Jean, frozen in the act of coiling a line. Their eyes met. Renard gave the slightest, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Don't talk! Don't name me!" Pierre looked away. Up the street was Jacques, held back by 2 soldiers, shouting, struggling. Pierre's heart clenched. No, not Jacques. He deliberately looked away from his son, focusing straight ahead, giving nothing away. They took him to the commandantur, the old town hall. The room was cold, bare. A desk, a chair, a single harsh lamp. The young lieutenant was there, and a man Pierre didn't know, older, harder, an officer of the Abwehr, military intelligence. His eyes were like chips of flint, no uniform insignia, but the authority radiated from him. Herr Vogel, he spoke perfect icy French. Pierre Moreau, fisherman, Vogel didn't ask. He stated. He paced slowly, a predator circling. "We have a mystery, a great ship, the Scharnhorst, pride of our fleet, crippled in our own waters. But debris, unidentified marine debris." He stopped, facing Pierre. Thick hemp rope, reinforced with chain, very distinctive, very local. He leaned on the desk, his face close to Pierre's. "You were seen, old man, near the harbor that night, in a small boat. Your dory was found hidden on the shingle." Pierre remained silent. He looked at the wall behind Vogel, at a crack in the plaster. He focused on that, not on Vogel's eyes, not on the fear coiling in his gut. He thought of the sea, the deep, quiet water. He thought of the net sinking, then rising. He thought of Elodie's touch. "Your son," Vogel continued smoothly, "Jacques Moreau. He is enthusiastic. Talks too much in the estaminet. Talks of nets, of stopping giants. He believes you did this thing." Vogel's smile was thin, cold. He is being persuasive. But persuasion can be exhausting. For a young man, he nodded to the feldgendarmes by the door. One left. Moments later, sounds came from the corridor. Not screams, worse, the sickening thud of fists on flesh. A muffled grunt. Then Jacques' voice, ragged but defiant. "Va te faire foutre, c'est l'eau." Another thud, silence, then a whimper. Pierre closed his eyes. The crack in the plaster blurred. He saw Jacques as a boy, learning to tie a bowline knot. Saw his fire, his anger at the world. Saw Elodie's spark. He felt the cold stone floor beneath his boots. He took a slow breath. The sea is patient. The tide always returns. He opened his eyes, looked at the crack again. He said nothing. Vogel slammed his fist on the desk.
"Talk, old man!"
"Who helped you? Renard, others, name them. Or your son dies in this room, slowly." Pierre turned his head slowly, met Vogel's flinty eyes. His own face was calm, weathered, the face of the channeled cliffs. "I'm a fisherman," he said, his voice low but clear, carrying in the quiet room. "I know the sea. I know its moods, its currents, its hidden things." That night, the tide was strong. The fog was thick. Things get lost. things get caught. He shrugged, a small, simple movement. The sea, it takes what it wants. Sometimes it gives back broken pieces, rope, chain. Who can say where it comes from? Who can say what it tangles? He looked down at his hands, turning them over slowly, as if examining the ingrained dirt. I lost my net weeks ago. A good net, heavy, useless now, the soldiers say. He looked back at Vogel, his gaze steady. Ask the sea who stopped your ship. I only mend what the sea spits back. Vogel stared at him, rage warred with a grudging disbelief. This old peasant, calm, implacable, blaming the sea. He looked at the crack in the plaster Pierre had been studying. A meaningless flaw. He saw no fear, only a deep, immovable certainty. Like bedrock, he gestured sharply. The sounds from the corridor stopped. Jacques was dragged back in, bruised, bleeding from the lip, but upright, defiant. He looked at his father, saw the calm, understood. He straightened his shoulders. Vogel leaned close again, his voice a venomous whisper. You think your silence protects them? Protects your son? This village, we will find the truth. We always do. Your stubbornness only makes the punishment harsher. For everyone, he straightened, adjusting his tunic. Take them back, but watch them. Watch him. He looked at Pierre with cold contempt. The sea doesn't fight wars, old man. Men do, and men break. They were released, thrown out onto the steps of the town hall. Jacques stumbled, leaning on his father. Père, I'm sorry. I couldn't. Hush, Pierre said, his arm around his son's shoulders. You gave nothing away. That is strength. They walked slowly home. The village watched, silent, respectful, afraid. That night, as Pierre tended to Jacques' bruises with Elodie's help, she had slipped into their cottage unseen, bringing clean cloths and a precious sliver of soap. The weight of Vogel's threat hung heavy. They knew it wasn't over. The net had stopped the battleship. But the war wasn't won. Not here, not yet. The storm broke a week later. Not a naval battle, a raid. British commandos, landing craft on the beaches, flares splitting the night sky, machine gun fire rattling like deadly hail, grenades exploding with sharp, brutal cracks. Sainte-Marie-du-Mont became a battlefield. German garrison troops, caught off guard, fought fiercely from fortified houses. Pierre dragged Jacques and Elodie into the cellar of a bombed-out bakery when bullets shattered the window of their cottage. They huddled in the dark, the acrid smell of dust and cordite thick in the air. Above them boots pounded, shouts in German and English, the crash of doors being smashed in, the terrible, intimate sounds of close-quarters fighting. Then heavy boots on the stairs. A flashlight beam stabbed down into the cellar. 2 German soldiers, young, faces grimed with dirt, eyes wide with fear and adrenaline. They pointed their rifles. One barked an order. Raus. Schnell. Get out. Pierre stepped forward slightly, shielding Jacques and Elodie. He raised his hand slowly. The soldier with the flashlight swept the beam over them. It caught Pierre's face. Recognition flashed in the young man's eyes. The soldier from the cottage search. The one who'd called him a Dummkopf. He lowered his rifle a fraction. He looked at his comrade, then back at Pierre. He saw the old man's calm face, the young woman trembling behind him, the bruised boy. He saw not partisans, civilians, trapped. He remembered the absurd story of the net, the old man's quiet dignity, the sea taking what it wanted. He snapped his fingers sharply at his comrade, said something rapid in German. Alte Männer, Frauen, unwichtig, old man, woman, unimportant. He waved them back with his rifle, not unkindly, but firmly. Bleib unten, stay down! He turned, pulling his comrade with him. Come! Die Engländer sind an der Kirche. Come, the English are at the church. They vanished back up the stairs, the sounds of battle swelling then fading as they ran towards the gunfire. Pierre sank back against the damp cellar wall, his legs suddenly weak. Elodie pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob of relief. Jacques stared at the stairs, disbelief warring with anger. They let us go, he whispered. Why? Pierre looked at the spot where the beam had been. He thought of the young soldier's face, the flicker of something that wasn't just duty, something human. Because the sea, he said quietly, his voice rough, doesn't only take. Sometimes it gives back. He closed his eyes. He saw not the net fouling the propeller. He saw a young German soldier choosing not to see, choosing mercy in the chaos. The war was a monstrous machine. But men were still men, even in uniform, even in the dark. The raid was over by dawn. The commandos withdrew. The Germans re-established control, bruised and furious. But the damage was done. Morale was shattered. And the shadow of the crippled Scharnhorst, the ghost net that might have done it, lingered. Pierre and his family survived. Jacques, fueled by the raid and his father's example, slipped away a month later, joined the Marquis in the hills. Pierre never saw him again. He heard whispers months later. Jacques died blowing a bridge near Caen, June 1944. D-Day. Pierre stood on the beach that morning, watching the distant flashes on the horizon, feeling the old Channel wind on his face. He didn't weep. He just felt the net in his empty hands. Another loss, another sacrifice sunk deep. Elodie stayed. She helped Pierre rebuild his cottage after a stray shell damaged it. They didn't speak of love. Not in that time, in that place. But there was a quiet understanding, a shared cup of thin coffee by the fire, her hand brushing his as she passed a bowl. The way she'd hum softly, a tune from before the war, while mending his shirts. Small comforts, fragile warmth in the long winter of occupation. She understood his silence, his need to wait, like the tide. She had her own battles, her own quiet resistance, tending the wounded German and French alike when she could, hiding a downed RAF pilot in her room for 2 terrifying days, feeding him broth, listening to his homesick talk of Yorkshire dales while German patrols banged on doors outside. The conflict between fear and fascination. Fear for her life, fascination with this boy from another world who spoke of green fields and cricket. The bittersweet warmth of sharing a stolen apple. The touch of a blanket tucked around trembling shoulders. Human lust for life, sorrow for what was lost, fragile hope for dawn. Never vulgar, only human, only cinematic in its quiet depth. She smiled sometimes, looking at Pierre mending nets by the firelight, not knowing why, just because the ember still glowed. The war ended. May 8th, 1945, VE Day. Joy erupted in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. Bells rang, real bells, not curfew bells. People spilled into the streets, weeping, laughing, embracing strangers. Old men danced clumsy jigs. Children waved tattered flags. Pierre stood on his doorstep watching. He felt the joy, a distant warmth, like the sun finally breaking through storm clouds after a long voyage. But his face was still, calm. He saw Renard across the square, raising a bottle of wine, catching Pierre's eye. Renard grinned, a wide, unburdened grin, and raised the bottle high in salute. Pierre raised his hand in quiet acknowledgement. He saw Elodie caught in a swirl of celebrating women, laughing freely for the first time in years. Her eyes found his. She broke away, walked through the crowd to him. She didn't speak. She just took his rough, knotted hand in both of hers. Her eyes shone with tears, and that familiar spark, brighter now, unafraid. She squeezed his hand. A long, silent moment. Then she was swept back into the celebrating throng. Pierre watched her go. He didn't follow. He turned and walked down to the beach. He stood at the water's edge, where he'd launched the dory that night. The sun was warm on his back. The channel sparkled, blue and endless, washing cleanly over the shingle. No fog, no patrol boats, just gulls crying. He closed his eyes. He heard the wind, the old wind, carrying the salt, the kelp, the distant laughter from the village. He heard the grinding shriek of tearing steel, the panicked German shouts, the thud of fists on flesh in a cold room, Jacques' defiant shout, Elodie's silent sob of relief in the cellar. The young soldiers muttered, "Unwichtig." He heard the quiet snap of the float line, the net rising. He opened his eyes, looked out at the vast indifferent sea. They had laughed at his net, called it useless, a relic, a waste of good rope, until it held the throat of a leviathan, until it stopped the unstoppable. Not with guns, not with bombs, with patience, with understanding, with the quiet, stubborn strength of things that endure. The sea doesn't rage against the rock. It wears it down, slowly. The tide always returns. Pierre Moreau is gone now. Died in his sleep, they say. In that same cottage, by the sea. They buried him on the cliff overlooking the channel. Simple stone, no fanfare, no grand words about battleships. Just Pierre Moreau, Fisherman, 1901-1978. Sometimes on quiet afternoons, if you walk that cliff path, you might see an old man, or think you see him, standing at the edge, looking out, his hands resting on a simple wooden railing. Weathered hands, knotted like old roots. You might imagine he's listening to the wind, to the sea, to the ghosts of propellers turning in deep, dark water, to the echo of laughter that turned to silence, to the whisper of hemp rope sinking, rising, holding fast. They laughed. Oh, they laughed. But the sea remembers what men forget, and in the deep, quiet places, where the currents shift and time loses its grip, the net still holds. Not steel, not wood, not even rope. It holds the truth that the smallest things, the quietest hands, the most stubborn hearts can change the course of giants, can turn the tide. One knot, one cast, one impossible, useless net at a time. Remember that. When the world laughs at your rope, remember the fisherman and the sea, always the sea.